Thank you, Pete. It's really great to be here. I have a long association with FEE. I guess it was in about 1966 when I was a college student. The FEE would run 3-day seminars, and a couple buddies of mine and I from Brooklyn College, where we were going, came up to FEE, and that was a watershed of my life because at that time there was very little opportunity to systematically study Austrian economics anywhere, and FEE was really the only place to get that. And it was just a gratifying experience seeing all of the wonderful people that Leonard had handled who lectured here. So I have a very fond affection for this place, and I hope that you feel that same way, and when you leave you'll reflect on that as well. But today I want to talk about the political economy of government and science, and I'm going to organize my presentation around some, basically around the work of Hayek and Polanyi on orders, and that provides for me the conceptual framework from which to analyze this particular area of interest. Now, the economics of science is a field in economics, and it has over the years attracted a lot of interesting contributions from all kinds of people, but it's been dominated quite heavily, almost exclusively, by neoclassical economists. And what the economics of science and the work in that area has tried to do is understand from an economic standpoint, from the eyes of an economist, from the tools that economists use, how the production and transmission of knowledge, in this case scientific knowledge, is conducted under various conditions. Now, my talk today will highlight some of that neoclassical work, but that's a separate lecture, really, and I'll just be very brief and kind of glide through that, mainly from a critical standpoint. And the point of doing that is to differentiate the neoclassical approach to the economics of science from the approach that I and my co-author, Thomas McQuaid, have tried to develop over the last several years. Now, should get this right. Oh, but before you see, if all of my lecture notes, my PowerPoint are available to you just by emailing me. I'll be more than happy to share anything I have on this matter with you. My website is a little bit dated. We all have websites, but it's a pain to have to update them every so often. So that contains a lot of information. Some of the papers on my website, but there's a lot of stuff that's not there, unfortunately. I've got to attend to that, obviously, pretty soon. So this is my basic outline here. And after talking a little bit about the classical approach to economics of science, I'm going to try to identify some what I will call Austrian lineage to the economics of science, and by concentrating, as I've indicated, by Hayek and Polanyi, and their conception of orders to examine science as and this is a non-catalactic kind of spontaneous order. Now, the word catalactic simply means the theory of exchange. Catalaxy is a particular arrangement in which exchanges take place. It's from the old, actually it comes from the Greek, which means to welcome in. And that's a great metaphor for what the catalaxy does, because under the conditions by which catalactic activity occurs, it is an inclusive kind of way of bringing people together. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the the role of government in U.S. history as far as research and development funding is concerned. A brief historical overview will help identify some of the issues that I'll presently speak about, and we'll then turn to a discussion of the effects of government intervention in science. And that occurs in manifold ways, but the way that I have tried to unpack that is to pretty much follow the money. I've learned over the years in investigating this sort of stuff that if you follow the dollars, that kind of gives you a pretty good take on what's going on, despite all the rhetoric, despite all the political posturing and what have you. So that's the basic outline I'd like to follow. There's a lot here. As I said, it's really a couple of lectures here to all squeeze together, in fact. But let me just start with Hayek and Polanyi. Well, Hayek developed this notion of orders as he moved through his career. Orders are, what are they? Well, pretty much we have to start thinking about a set of institutional arrangements in which are populated by components. Now that can be, insects, social insects. It can be phenomena from the natural world. But for us, what we're interested in, of course, is social arrangements. So an order can kind of be defined as a system in which there are certain kinds of institutional framework. There's an institutional framework by which the actions and interactions of the components, in this case individuals, interact one to the other. Okay? And the feature about orders is that the byproducts of those interactions generate outcomes which are identifiable and which can ordinarily be associated with certain kinds of patterns. So let's take the matter of a market system or a catallaxy. And in that particular setting, there is a framework of property rights, rules and routines of one kind or another that define what people can do within that framework, and the outcomes that are generated are the byproducts of those interactions. Now, no one sits down within a catallax and say, oh, let's create some kind of particular broad outcome that we as observers can identify. People just pursue their interests. People just undertake action motivated by their own purposes. They identify their means, their ends, as you heard from Israel Kirzner the other day. And in doing so, though, there is a set of byproducts that are produced which are not necessarily the intention of any of those individuals. All right? That means that these side effects, these byproducts, okay, allow us to kind of look into that catallaxy and identify what's going on and how to understand it. The principal byproduct of a catallaxy is the price system. Prices are an emergent phenomenon, okay, produced by the interactions of individuals. Okay? And the price system is an outcome that cannot be produced in any other way other than by the interactions of those individuals operating within that particular framework. Okay? Now, these byproducts are usually unintended consequences of those interactions. Okay? And the interesting part about that is, of course, that by virtue of those byproducts, the system is allowed to function in interesting and identifiably, usually benign ways that allow people to, in fact, achieve their purposes or achieve their ends, and also to prosper and you know, do things that they want to do. Okay? Now, there are obviously instances where there are arrangements that are set up, and sometimes those arrangements are imposed upon the system. Sometimes they are endogenous to the system, in which those byproducts are something that we might say, uh-oh, that's not really good. So we have to recognize that, as Hayek did, that sometimes the spontaneous social orders generate byproducts which are not desirable according to some set of criteria. Hayek identified these as sort of cultural dead ends. Okay? So we have to recognize at least that not all spontaneous orders are desirable, not all are benign, that in some instances the rules which are generated within those spontaneous orders produce byproducts which are undesirable from a certain point of view. Now, Hayek argued that when you have that situation where you have these, what I would call cultural dead ends, okay, the system will eventually be destabilized in some way, and the order will kind of disintegrate. Okay, they usually don't last because they are not serving in a long-run sense the interest of the participants. On the other hand, you have spontaneous orders which are subject to incursions by third parties, exogenous factors that can generate either the rules or determine the outcomes in some fashion that also are undesirable from some point of view. Okay? Government intervention in the marketplace, minimum wage laws, all kinds of stuff like that. Those are incursions, interventions that we as economists, as observers, can say, well, people may want to have those things, those price controls, but these are the consequences that will tend to follow. Okay? And very often those consequences will be orthogonal to the intentions of the people who have perpetrated those incursions. Okay? So sometimes you don't even need to impose normative criteria on evaluating those outcomes. Sometimes the outcomes are undesirable from the point of view of the people who have promoted those incursions. Okay? So that's kind of the way I'm going to talk about science. Okay? I want to distinguish ultimately between something I would call free science, i.e. non-intervention science, in the sense that science just functions as an emergent order. But my interest is to understand how these third-party interventions somehow can affect the scientific order in a particular and interesting way. Okay. Now, let me see if I want to go ahead yet. Whoa. Chop. Huh? Let me try it. We have a breakdown here. Oh, there we go. So I've already kind of talked about that. The very important point that I did not just mention was the fact that these systems, to survive and to function over the longer run, must be adaptive. They have to adjust to different events, different exogenous events, so that, if you have a market order which is subject to some sort of exogenous shock, like a supply side shock or something of that sort, the system to survive has to have the appropriate mechanisms to allow it to deal with these sorts of things. So one of the big issues in any kind of spontaneous or emergent order is its ability and its capacity to adapt appropriately in the face of disturbances. And of course, the adaptive qualities of what could have been market orders, say under central planning, central economic planning, usually have ended up as failures because of the inability of the system to adapt. And I'm going to make that argument a little bit later in the context of science. Okay. What am I doing wrong?
Wondering what the other direction. Over your shoulder. I think the computer's back there.
Oh, no wonder.
There you go.
I thought it was a smart screen. Because I'm so technologically handicapped, it's, you know, I'm just happy to see something on the thing here. Science, if you think about science, now, what is science? Well, science is a particular kind of outcome generated by the work of scientists. Yeah, that sounds sort of tautological, I guess it is. But we can endlessly discuss exactly what constitutes a scientific proposition and so forth. I don't think that's a very productive way to spend our time today. So I'm science as a particular arrangement that's populated by people who are interested in producing a certain kind of knowledge. We'll call that scientific knowledge. Okay, it can be physics, mathematics, economics, whatever. And those interactions conducted by the scientists themselves are governed by certain rules and conventions. Okay. Now, in the history of science, there, up until fairly recently, by that I mean roughly the mid-20th century, early 20th century, scientific orders were generated by the voluntary participation of individuals following certain kinds of routines. And a lot of those routines, the framework within which people operated as scientists and could identify themselves as working within a community of scientists, were endogenous. That is to say, these were the self-generated rules and routines that the community of scientists generated over the course of long periods of time. All right? So the byproduct of these interactions is the creation of scientific knowledge. Okay? Now, interestingly, the individuals who are populating a scientific order, or you can think of it as a scientific community to make it a little bit more concrete if you wish. The byproduct, the outcomes generated by those interactions constitute scientific knowledge, but the individuals who are doing this are perhaps doing it for all kinds of reasons which may or may not have anything to do with trying to find the truth. We don't have to assume that. All we want to argue is that people follow certain kinds of procedures, and in the course of doing that, the community of science comes up with what we could call scientific knowledge. The point is that scientific knowledge is a social byproduct of the scientific order. There's a lot of metaphors that kind of capture that. You know, we stand on the shoulders of our predecessors. In other words, our knowledge today is based upon the knowledge that has been generated by scientists for many, many years. All right? So when we talk about scientific knowledge and we say, well, scientist X has produced some new mathematical proof, okay? From that person's point of view, it may be scientific knowledge, but from the point of view of a social enterprise, okay, it has to, that isn't sufficient. It has to be, go through the crucible of other scientists' evaluation of that particular kind of byproduct in order to attain a status that could be more legitimately understood as constituting science. Okay? So the scientist working alone in his laboratory and never publishing, never interacting with other scientists, just doing experiments like, Baron von Frankenstein. Okay? That, in my judgment, isn't science in the sense of a social undertaking. It becomes, the results of that research can become science when that information and knowledge is transmitted to other scientists who have the opportunity to evaluate it, to criticize it, and to change it. And it's through that kind of social process that scientific knowledge can truly change. Okay? Now, notice here, I have not referred to the scientific order as a market or a catalactic order. Okay? Markets produce prices, market prices. They produce quantities of things that people buy and sell. Okay? But when we look at a scientific order, we don't find prices. What do we find? What we find are published articles. We find books, things that have been codified and dispersed and transmitted to others. But what we don't find are prices. Okay? So the point I'm trying to make here is that science is not a catalactic order, and that the kinds of metaphors that are routinely used to describe science, the marketplace of ideas, as if there's an exchange of ideas. I'll sell you my idea for a certain amount of money. That doesn't happen in science ordinarily. Okay? Now, it's possible that in some circumstances it can be. Okay? But in general, the kind of science that interests us here, I think, is of a kind which commands no particular market price, and the knowledge that's contained in that work is not appropriable as a property right in all instances. Okay? So when you read, pick up a physics book or pick up a physics journal, you're going to find articles in there and everything else. Okay? It becomes public in the truest sense of the term. Anybody can go get that article and read it. Not everybody's going to understand it, okay? But it's there for your taking. There is no property right that allows the author of that work to capture any of the implicit returns that others get from it. Okay? So it's tenuous to suggest, therefore, that science is a kind of economic process, as in the same sense as market activity is. All right, and now there are instances. Let me put this on the board here. There are instances where we can identify things that we could call basic research. The kind of stuff that theoretical physicists might do. Okay, and then there's applied research. There may be something comes out of that applied research that can be developed into real-world applications and maybe take on a certain commercial output. Okay, now as you move toward those commercial outputs, then of course the activities become more and more closely identifiable with market activity. Okay? But when we talk about pure science over here, okay, that tends not to be the case. So the distinction here is not trivial, because it means that the institutions which govern the scientific order are different from the institutions that govern market activity. And the failure to make those kinds of distinctions has run into all kinds of problems and misunderstandings, I think, that have really retarded a fuller understanding of the scientific order and the way economists have looked at it. Okay? So I identify, and McQuaid and I identify, a institutional arrangement. It's a very simple one, which involves publication, P, PCR, the publication, the certifiability of that scientific knowledge, and the reputation that scientists get from producing knowledge which has been found useful to other scientists. Okay? So this PCR mechanism, if you will, is the way in which basic science tends to operate. You publish, you get citations, you get certified as having produced something of value, and then the scientist's reputation is thereby enhanced. Okay? To assume that the science is a market activity requires you to dispense with this kind of particular institutional setting, and hence leads you into an analysis which is unsuited for the behaviors that we're trying to understand. Okay? There is also, as in any other emergent order, these other factors that you have to keep in mind. That is to say, the scientific order is undeniably adaptive, that the pace of change in what constitutes knowledge is very, very rapid, and has increasingly become more and more rapid as we have gone along. It is necessarily error-correcting, that is, bad ideas get filtered out, maybe not right away, but over the long run. Okay? And it is self-coordinating. No one has to impose on this particular institutional setting a set of conclusions or anything else that govern the way scientists interact. Rather, these institutional mechanisms of publication, citation, and reputation serve that whole function and allow for the system to be adaptive, allow it to be error-correcting, and also to self-coordinate. Okay? Now, this is not to say, and I don't want to lead you to think, that science is always on a track for better knowledge. Okay? If you look back in history, there's a lot of too many counterfactuals that you can identify that I think you would have to take account of. But what we can say that error correction is the long-run tendency of the scientific order, and that ultimately, if this mechanism is honored, then the error correction mechanism has the greater chance of, purging the blacker stuff out of science. Okay? So it's not as if we're claiming here that science produces, quote, capital T truth. Okay? What we are claiming, though, is that there is a body of knowledge that scientists come to accept as being the best you can do at the current point, and that knowingly, the stuff that we do know right now is probably going to be adjusted, revised over the course of time by other scientists who are themselves involved in this enterprise. Okay. Now, Michael Polanyi, there's a lot of dissertations screaming to be written about Michael Polanyi. Michael Polanyi was from Central Europe. He emigrated to the UK in the 30s, late 30s, mid-30s. And he was a trained chemist. His university post was in the chemistry department in England, in one of the universities. And he was a hard-working, typical kind of scientist. But he kind of was a man of the Renaissance, too. And he had a lot of different interests. And one of his interests was to understand the social arrangements that generate the scientific enterprise. And he came up with an idea that we today call spontaneous orders. And he, of course, Adam Smith kind of has some of that stuff there. Hume does, but Menger, too. But Polanyi had this interest in understanding how the interactions of scientists worked in generating science, generating knowledge. So he started writing about what we would today call spontaneous orders from the science. The reason which he apparently got really interested in this stuff was that during this time in the UK, there arose a movement from within the scientific community called the social relations movement. Okay? The social relations movement was a huge, a very large collection of university scientists who felt that science needed to be reined in to service the more concrete needs of people. Now, the context here, of course, is that this group of people, and the leader was a guy named Bernal. If you want to Google him, he's one of the bad guys here. Okay, he was a physicist. Bernal and his cohorts were all very, very sympathetic to what was going on in the Soviet Union. And they looked to the Soviet Union and they saw what they thought was this great success story. Stalin had finally solved the problem of social organization through central planning, and they then said, look, what we've got to do is organize science, the practice of science, in the same way that Stalin has organized the Soviet economy. Okay? We've got to make science and plan science in order that we can satisfy these concrete needs of people. Okay? Well, Polanyi went through the roof. He went ballistic on this stuff, and he and another guy called John Baker organized what is called the Society of Freedom in Science. And the argument that Polanyi presents is very simple. He says, it's precisely because we scientists do not have all of the answers, i.e. scientific answers, is the reason why we have to reject central planning of science. You cannot plan science because we don't know what the results are of our scientific analysis. We don't know. If we knew the answers, we wouldn't need science. The problem is that science and scientists must be left free to autonomously engage in the pursuit of truth. And it's the only way, according to Polanyi, that science can work. You've got to let scientists alone to muddle through, as it were, the puzzles, the problems, the questions that they are trying to deal with, and allow them to check out things, make mistakes, and what have you. But there's no other way that you can organize or establish an institutional framework to allow scientists to do that, and that central planning of science is a contradiction in terms. Okay? Science requires freedom from state planning. If you don't have freedom from state planning, you cannot have science. That was Polanyi's bullet point. Okay? Now, the activity that was going on at this particular juncture in history, of course, is the late 1930s, thereabouts. England had been was at war with Germany, and one of the main questions was, how can the Allies marshal scientific talent in order to provide the scientific information needed to wage war? Radar and all these technological things that were on the horizon. And Polanyi argued that yes, during wartime, you may have to have central direction of the kinds of things that scientists undertake. Okay? I don't know if I'd buy that, but that was his position. Okay? But his argument was, well, after the war, what kind of system are we going to have? And he directed his energies toward trying to make an argument, to make a case for what science had to have in order to produce scientific knowledge after the war. John Baker and Polanyi and about 10 other guys of this society they organized were workaholics in writing letters, enlisting support, and by gosh, against all odds, they were able to nip in the bud and to have the British government reject any kind of post-World War II central planning of science. He won the battle. He saved science in the UK. The guy is a real hero in that regard. But there was one little problem. Polanyi simply assumed that the only way scientists could undertake their endeavors was with state funding. Okay? Now, it was taken for granted that this was the arrangement that had to be adhered to. After all, scientists operating in the universities in England were often paid by the government, and it just soon seemed natural, I think, to Polanyi that that's the way it had to be. Now, what he didn't consider were the possible effects of government funding of science on the autonomy and freedom of science. Okay? So he won the battle. He prevented central planning in science, but at the same time, he had a problem, didn't quite take seriously the implications of the kind of massive government funding that would ensue in the aftermath of World War II. Okay? That's a problem. So, let's take a look at some of this historical intervention by government in science. And my aim now is to kind of shift gears a little bit from this conceptual approach to a more concrete historical approach and try to identify how is it, why was it that government found it necessary to intrude into science. And one of the things that we find is that it kind of happened willy-nilly, at least in the United States. You know, ever since the Republic was formed, Lewis and Clark was a government enterprise that funded Lewis and Clark's explorations in the Northwest. All kinds of other rinky-dink kinds of things were funded by the government. Morse and his wireless telegraph, that was a government-funded project. Okay? But these were just incidental things. There was no systematic government funding of science. Science was left to scientists, and that was the end of it. But as we move into the more modern period, say the Civil War, thereabouts, a couple things start changing. It became obvious that to both the North and the South during the Civil War that it was important to fund for military reasons scientists in producing better and more destructive weaponry. Okay? So we start seeing the role of defense warfare on the apparent need to fund more and more science, even basic science, in order to get the upper hand against your adversaries. And if you look over the long course of history, that's what in fact you find. That during war times, Civil War, World War I, World War II, and onward to the Cold War and so forth, as I'll show you in a moment, one of the prime movers of government funding of science was centered on defense or warfare. Okay? I'll just finish this here. The watershed event, though, starts occurring during the FDR administration. Even though there was a lot of government intervention in science under Wilson and during the 20s, basically it was underfunded to a substantial extent, and most of those institutions that the government created just withered away. But during the New Deal, Roosevelt came up with this notion that the welfare of society depends upon science. That is to say, the better and more science you can get in terms of basic research, the more development of those ideas and the commercial applications are going to benefit people. The idea was that the direction of causality moves from basic science in that direction toward commercial application. So, ergo, to have a better society, fight poverty and all of that, to control for the Depression, FDR reasoned, well, we need to fund more science. And it was during the New Deal that FDR set up a whole bunch of new institutions, research councils, resource boards. I mean, it was the alphabet soup of government agencies started then. And the object was to fund science during peacetime. And that was, I think, the decisive turning point in a lot of this stuff, because heretofore, scientific government funding of science was limited to the warfare and identifiable needs of the country to survive. Well, you can make that argument. That's not an implausible reason. But what FDR did was say, no, we need it during peacetime too. Okay. Now, notice here that the mentality of FDR and his New Dealers mimics very closely the social relations movement that I just mentioned earlier in the UK. That science ought to serve social purposes. It should be directed towards social purposes to satisfy social problems. And it's that connection that I think, again, is the subject of could be the subject of a lot of interesting research to the effect of the stuff going on in the UK and how it seeped into the New Dealers' mentalities. Now, notice here, during this period of time, you can go back and read all of the archival stuff that you want, and you're not going to find any market failure arguments that you've probably heard about in your economics courses that were used to justify this kind of, relatively speaking, massive government intervention under FDR. Okay? The market failure argument, that science is a public good, and that therefore, and if you can't appropriate the proceeds from that knowledge, then it's going to be underproduced. That's the basic market failure argument. That never appears here. This never appears. So the argument that the reason why we have government intervention in science is to solve a public goods problem is not right. Now, that argument has been used from the 1950s on, off and on again. But even so, it doesn't really seem to constitute a driver of any significance in terms of understanding how seriously the incursion of government into science has been. Now we have science and government being bound together and ever more strongly through, funding science to make economies more competitive. If you look at the European Euroland, they have gone hog wild in promoting cartel-like arrangements between government, universities, and private organizations, firms, to collaborate in producing scientific knowledge and its applications in order to become a bit more competitive economically. That same argument is now being used by Obama. If we don't have government funding of science, they think, we will become uncompetitive. Okay? This is where we're at now. Problem here. When you introduce these large institutions, and in particular government, you've got a big players problem. What is a big player? A big player is an institution, such as government, but it could be something else as well, that can dominate the incursion into the marketplace, or in this case, the scientific order, and without paying any price for doing so. In other words, in our case, when we talk about science and government, the government is the big gorilla in the living room doling out a whole bunch of money, and they do it the way they want. Okay? There is a unconstrained kind of activity going on here. The only constraint is a fiscal one. Now, how many dollars can the government actually accumulate to give out and control science, or to direct science? Okay? So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. Here's some quick charts. I'm not going to, they're pretty self-explanatory. You can see here that the Cold War was, in the modern post-World War II period, was the driver of government funding of science. You can 17-fold increase as of 1909. It's even larger now. And you can see the proportions of non-defense to defense R&D funded by the government as being pretty evenly divided at some points, although now the defense stuff has kind of dominated more recently. Did I miss one?
Yes.
There we go. Interestingly, though, and this will speak a little bit to the market failure argument, a little perhaps. The market failure argument essentially results in a claim that scientific knowledge will be underproduced unless it's publicly funded. Yet, when you look at the data, you can see that private industry expenditures on research and development is by far the bigger quantity, by far, and it's always pretty much always been that way. You know, Terence Keeley, another guy that you probably want to read if you're interested in this stuff. Kealey. Terence Keeley's a Brit. And he's a scientist, trained chemist, biochemist. But he wrote a great book on the economics of science, and said, "Well, where's the market failure here? You know, look, you know, what's going on? Why do we need all this government funding?" That's a flippant remark, but you can see here that the argument that there's underproduction of scientific knowledge or scientific funding is, you know, it's not self-evident that there is. Okay, we'd have to look into this a little bit more carefully, perhaps. One thing, though, that is important is that as far as basic science is concerned, government is indeed the bigger player, and right now it provides about 60% of all basic research. Okay, and the presumption is that if that were not funded by government, that basic research would not be undertaken. I don't know if that's correct or not, for couple simple reasons. Number one, this causality that I indicated before, which has driven the large amount of funding to basic science by the government, that linear kind of causation from basic science to things that people want and make life better for us is not causal. In fact, there's a ton of evidence suggesting that it goes this way all the time. Okay? That is to say that very often it's in the commercial arena where puzzles become evident, and the people who are trying to actually develop and commercialize various applications associated with science say, well, wait a minute, we need better science. But there's some puzzles here that we haven't quite figured out. So they actually end up moving backwards, in a sense, to create better science in terms of basic science. The question that I would raise, and it's a very hard question to actually empirically answer, is if government were not funding basic science to the extent it does, would that be picked up by the private sector? That's an open question. The evidence suggests that there's a lot of reasons why it might, and then there's some reasons which would argue against that. Okay. The other point I want to make here is the role of academic institutions as complicitous in all of this. Academic institutions are by far the major recipient of government funding of science. A lot of national defense stuff goes through universities. A lot of basic research, almost all of it goes through universities. Very little of it, proportionately speaking, goes through so-called government labs, like Los Alamos or there's a whole bunch of these things all over the country. Those are the little green ones here. Those government labs. That's what that means. But you can see that a lot of universities and the colleges and universities receive the bulk of those funds. So that's an interesting question here because, you know, the universities are not just recipients of these funding funds, but also become lobbyists for the continuation and perpetuation of these funds. So there's a client relationship, a principal-agent problem here that is very interesting to look into as well. Also, the data is now coming out just recently. That's why it's not a pretty picture of some more recent data on of government and science. And as you can see here, from 2009 to the 2011 budget request by the administration, where the funds are slotted to go. Again, Obama has announced in several times in written form and through his agents that he is going to emphasize certain aspects of science that he wishes to fund as opposed to other things. For example, planetary, solar system space exploration has been killed. Just killed. They just defunded the whole damn thing. And those funds that had previously gone to NASA for that purpose are now being rechanneled into funds for planetary Earth science. Why do you think that is the case? Well, a big part of the Obama agenda is to get the science of the basic science and the scientific applications associated with climate change in place so they can pursue their environmental agenda. Okay, but you can see here the changes that have occurred percentage-wise from 2010, which was to the 2011. Notice here the highlighted column in red. That's the stimulus package of 2009, and you can see that the amounts that were allocated totaled over $18 billion under ARA, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. It's a misnomer, obviously. But I'm going to highlight, I want you to remember this column a little bit, and I'm going to return to that in a moment if I have time. What's the problem? I am. Okay. Okay. This is a somewhat more detailed breakdown of some of these changes here, and you can see where the emphasis has gone. NASA plus 18.3 for their planetary research. NSF, National Science Foundation, got a hefty increase. The Department of Commerce got a lot for its research. All right. I'm not sure what's all involved there. I mean, to pick apart these aggregate data is a real bitch because, oops, you have to edit that out in the official audio here. But notice defense has gone down a little bit. Homeland Security has taken a hit. So some changes are reflective here in these more detailed numbers. All right. Now, what's the upshot here before I move on here? The upshot here is that there is a significant presence of government in science. And as we've come to know science, most people come to accept that that's the appropriate way to do things. What I'd like to emphasize here is that there are costs, that concerns that we need to take account of if we wish to understand fully the consequences of government funding of science. Okay? Now, some of these are relatively benign, but others I think are more serious. I organize my discussion here in terms of the 3 Ds. Directional effects, government funding, effects that are destabilizing to science, destabilizing to science, and government funding which can actually, or government incursions which can actually distort science. Now, keep in mind one thing. Directional effects, destabilizing effects do not necessarily affect the quality of the science produced. Okay? That is to say, if, and the context here has to be the PCR mechanism. You know, that's the fundamental institution that governs what we consider to be the ways in which science and scientific knowledge is produced. Just because you can redirect the funds from Homeland Security to NASA, or redirect funds from defense to subsidizing research on windmills, doesn't mean that that science is somehow inferior. That the byproducts of that knowledge thereby produced via that funding is somehow inferior to other kinds of knowledge. All that's happened is that there's been a shift in the direction of the science that's being undertaken. Instead of doing Y, we're doing X. Now, any funder, whether it be government or Earhart or private foundations, you name it, they all have interests that govern the way they want to see questions approached and answered. They try to affect the direction of science. If you get a grant from your university to do a particular kind of scientific research, very often that comes with some strings. These are the kinds of parameters you have to work within. Okay? It doesn't have any implication whatsoever about the quality of the science thereby produced. All that's happened is that instead of addressing one question, a different question is being addressed. So that's just a directional change. It may not be particularly momentous for the kind of science produced, but it does have implications down the road under a couple of conditions. If the scientific funding that's being funded in that way is being funded by a big player, i.e. the big gorilla in the living room, that makes a difference, because now, instead of having a lot of little decentralized funding sources, you've got one big source funding most of the stuff, and they can really make a difference in terms of what kind of science is going to be produced. Now, that may or may not be bad. I'm not making a claim here about the normative value of that, but certainly if you align that directional shift and fold into it the obvious policy agenda of the funders, then you've got a different kind of issue here, right? In other words, the funding is being directed so as to support a particular policy stance that the funders, in this case the government, wishes to pursue. So, in the case of let's say the Obama administration, the redirection of scientific funding toward environmental, climate change sorts of stuff, okay, is part and parcel and cannot be disassociated from their larger political agenda of passing cap and trade. Okay? So it's not that these things, the science is bad, but it's the politicization of science that carries consequences of interest to social scientists, it seems to me. Okay? And there's all kinds of ways you can impact this. There's a huge literature out there on this stuff. In any of my papers, you can look those up if you like. And I don't want to dwell on that too much. And there we go. Okay, and I give you some examples here of the ways in which government has tried to redirect scientific inquiry. Hydrogen cars. It's going to cost about $200 billion, estimated now, to change over to hydrogen cars. They've already spent about $1.2 billion on researching that. There's all kinds of stuff. This list could be pages long. Okay, this gives you a flavor of how a big player in government funding can really direct the kinds of science that's being undertaken. Okay. Another redirection I thought you might find interesting is congressional R&D earmarks. You know what earmarks are. These are set-aside funds that are passed usually without dissent in the Congress. Every congressman gets his shot at putting into say an omnibus bill on transportation, some R&D earmarks, usually funding for the state university that he represents or something like that. You know, and what's interesting though is how these have just proliferated like rabbits. They were so minor for years and years. These are in millions of dollars, current dollars, not real dollars, and you can see that in the late 90s, things really start getting out of hand here, okay? And even despite the notoriety that earmarks have had and aroused the ire of a lot of the voters, still the Congress is unrestrained in doing these sorts of things. It is a way, of course, for them to get reelected by doling out funds to their universities and so forth and so on. At the same time, the costs are dispersed among the overall tax-paying public, and there's your public choice problem. Destabilizing effects. Okay, go back to and I'm not going to try doing it on this, to the ARA funding in 2009, the stimulus package for R&D in 2009. Okay, if you add that increment to the increment that was already authorized for 2009, and compare it then to the amounts that were authorized for federal R&D from, say, 2008. Okay? So we're comparing 2008 to the total amount that was allocated for R&D by the government in 2009. That includes then the stimulus aspect. There, if you did do the math, you'll find that there's been over a 15% change in that 1 year. That means that resources are being pushed into certain scientific endeavors, and then the funding's going to run out, usually in a year or so, and what's going to happen to those resources? They're going to go somewhere else or get unemployed. Okay? Some of it was used to build new university labs, is being used to do that, new brick and mortar stuff for colleges. Okay? They got the money, let's spend it. Okay? But there's no subsequent follow-up funds that's going to be able to maintain a lot of that stuff. So what we have in effect then is almost a necessary boom-bust feature associated with the vagaries and the kinds of serendipity effects from alternating years of fat and lean as far as R&D federal government is concerned. So the point here is that it's easy to identify specific case studies where there was an enormous amount of funds directed, say, to fifth-generation computers back some years ago now. Billions and billions of dollars from Japan to the UK to France to America to generate these super computers. It failed. All of that, it attracted enormous amounts of talent, resources, and then it failed. And they all had to go somewhere else. So you have these built-in boom-bust cycles permeating the way in which scientific resources get allocated. I predict that now this is a little bit of a speculative point on my part, and I'm not a scientist, so this doesn't count maybe, but I think we're on the cusp of what I would call a dot green bubble. Okay, we're going to see a lot of fun. We are seeing a lot of funds allocated toward climate change and environmental sort of stuff on the premise that the science is settled. And I don't know if it is or not. I see people that say it isn't settled, that climate change may or may not be explainable by human activity. So if it's all just a bag of wind, then these enormous funds being allocated toward environmental research, climate change, may end up being not all that they cracked up to be. Okay. I'll give you one little example here. Here's some NSF funding. And you can see that over the years, NSF started in '51. it's kind of like just a nice upward sloping line, right? That's NSF budgets, okay? It looks pretty stable. But when you start unpacking NSF, and NSF is it's like a huge monolith, this huge enterprise, government enterprise, with what they call directorates. And each directorate is responsible for particular scientific areas. And the funding is channeled from NSF down to these directorates, and the directorates then allocate it through to scientists through peer review and competitive and bidding, not bidding, through review. But if you look more closely at some of these directorates, you can see that over these years from up to 2006, how unstable the funding is. Okay, this is representative. There are others that are even worse. You can see them here. Okay, so there's one that's pretty noticeable. So the question here is that because of the way in which the criteria are implemented for government funding of science, it follows from the evidence that there's a lot of instability one year to the next in where those funds go. And that creates instability, destabilization, I call it. Sort of like a boom-bust sort of argument here in science. So you're building into the scientific order a lot of variation, a lot of volatility that may not be particularly healthy for the scientists themselves as they've got to deal with these things. Okay. This is a good picture here. It just came out, and you can see here. They talk about destabilization, the effect on, in this case, basic research and development of the stimulus bill on R&D. Okay, that's a telling picture because it illustrates the potential for destabilizing government funding. Okay. Distortion effects, and I'm going to finish up with this. I hope I have, how's the time?
You have about 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. This is the more, unfortunately I left for last and I should have been more concise. This is the real big deal here. It turns out that there are any number of different specifics you can point to in which government funding of science and the associated regulatory oversight that comes with that, okay, through congressional oversight prerogatives, can actually affect the institutions of science. That is to say, instead of scientists generating reputational credibility on the basis of their contributions to science as evaluated by other scientists, it turns out that you can impose on that process things that either sidestep that process, contort it, or reject it entirely. That is to say, the institutions of science can be fundamentally altered by government incursion, by virtue of the fact that government is the big player and the overseer of all of this stuff, that they have powers that are denied to the private sector funders themselves. Okay? There are many, many examples of this. It's the most notorious one was one that was uncovered by Polanyi himself during Stalin's reign. Now, as you all know, during collectivization, the Soviet Union simply couldn't produce enough food, and what food they did, they were exporting it out of the Ukraine elsewhere for foreign exchange. Mass starvation. It was a big problem, big problem. This guy Lysenko comes along. He's a hack. He is literally a hack. He's not even a scientist, and comes up with these weirdo, wacko ideas about how to improve agricultural productivity. The upshot is that these ideas contravened the existing genetics theory that had been scientifically developed all around in the world, and which was very, very well accepted in Russia at this time. Okay, there was a thriving genetics community of biologists in Russia who were top-notch, well-known, internationally recognized scientists. Okay, Lysenko comes up, insinuates himself into the party structure, becomes a buddy to Stalin and is handed control over the agricultural sector in the Soviet Union. So what does he do? He says, we're going to implement my ideas. Well, these wacko ideas, it's Lamarckian, if you know any biology, Lamarckian ideas, which reject the standard genetics theories that we use, were imposed on science, and scientists were funded and controlled by virtue of their adherence to these weirdo ideas. Scientists that did not go along with the program, either two things happened to them, three things. Some of them were able to get out of the country. Those who couldn't were often sent to the Gulag, and some of the top-notch scientists were executed. Okay, so there was this systematic destruction of a whole scientific community that was made possible by these kinds of people and these kinds of institutions that they worked with. That went on, believe it or not, until 1960. I mean, not necessarily the executions of scientists, but this kind of weirdo approach to agricultural went on until 1960. Khrushchev endorsed it, and finally, it just collapsed. But there are other examples, less dramatic examples, and I don't have time to go through this. Many, I'm sorry, but the way science has investigated scientific output and attributed that science to fraud as opposed to simple scientific error is a very famous case by David Baltimore, a Nobel winner in biochem. And a paper that he co-authored had some problems with it. The Congressional Regulatory Oversight Committee got hold of it, and they accused him of fraud. They killed his reputation. He had to resign from president of the Rockefeller Institute. He finally ended up in Caltech as a regular professor. That is science by other means. Here you have a congressional committee, okay, insinuating itself into the scientific process with absolutely no basis for destroying this guy's reputation, and others in the case as well. ClimateGate, I don't think you probably have heard about this. It's probably not as serious as the newspapers or Fox News may be telling you. I'll leave it at that. We have a couple minutes, I hope, for some Q&A.
Actually, we're out of time right now for questions.
Okay.
If y'all can be back at 10:30 for the next lecture. Thank you very much.
I'll stick it. Thank you. I'll stick around as long as you like. If you have any questions, I'm sorry I didn't allocate my time better. Thank you.